While working on a video about Heart of Darkness, I ended up reading through dozens of accounts from Central Africa in the late 1800s. That period is often used as a backdrop in literature, but the more you look into it, the more you realize that the reality was often worse than anything fiction tried to portray. Among all the story's expeditions, conflicts, disappearances, there was one that kept coming up over and over again. Not always in the same way, not always with the same details, but always pointing to something deeply unsettling. It wasn't just another tragic event from that era. It was something people argued about, something historians still debate, and more importantly, something that may have influenced one of the most disturbing characters ever written, Kurtz. The story comes from a real expedition, one that was supposed to be a success. A mission backed by powerful people, led by one of the most famous explorers of the time. Instead, it became infamous. It's known as the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition, and depending on how you interpret the events, it didn't just fail, it exposed something far darker about the people involved. But what most people remember isn't the expedition itself. It's a question, a very specific one. Did a wealthy European, someone from a family whose name is still widely recognized today, pay to witness something so disturbing that even people at the time struggled to believe it? More specifically, did he knowingly take part in arranging the death of a young girl just to see what would happen next? That question sits at the center of what is often called the Jameson affair. And depending on which accounts you trust, the answer is either uncertain or far more obvious than people would like to admit. Before getting into it, it's worth saying this clearly, this is not an easy story. Much of what we know comes from first-hand accounts, journals, letters, statements. And what makes them difficult isn't just what they describe, but how they describe it. Events written in a way that feels almost detached, as if the people involved either didn't fully process what they were witnessing, or chose not to. Either way, if that's something you'd rather avoid, this might not be the story for you. To understand how any of this happened, you have to look at the broader context. In the late 1800s, Africa wasn't just being explored, it was being divided. European nations were competing to claim as much territory as possible in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. Officially, this was often framed as a humanitarian effort, bringing infrastructure, communication, and development. In reality, it was driven by resources: rubber, ivory, land, and the control that came with them. Conflicts were constant. European forces fought local groups, sometimes arming rival groups to fight on their behalf. Systems were created that allowed forced labor to exist under different names. Disease spread quickly, famine wasn't uncommon, and people on all sides were dying. But even within that context, one region stood out: the Congo. More specifically, what was called the Congo Free State. The name itself is misleading. It wasn't truly a state, and it certainly wasn't free. It was the personal possession of Leopold II. In 1885, instead of making the region a colony of Belgium, he claimed it as his own private territory, which meant that the usual political limits didn't apply. Losing control of a region, abandoning an official, letting a situation collapse without intervention, it wasn't a good look. But sending a full military operation deep into the region wasn't something most countries wanted to commit to. So instead, they turned to something else: a private expedition, led by Stanley, backed by multiple interests, and officially framed as a rescue mission. But from the beginning, it wasn't that simple. Because the route they chose didn't make much sense if rescuing the governor was the only goal. The fastest approach would have been from the east. Instead, they moved through the Congo, through territory controlled by Leopold II. Which meant that as they traveled, they weren't just moving toward their objective, they were also transporting goods, establishing connections, and expanding influence along the way. The rescue mission was real, but it wasn't the only thing happening. And that distinction matters, because it reveals something about the priorities behind it. From the very start, this wasn't purely about saving someone. It was also about opportunity. But unlike official military campaigns, the direction, risks, and ultimate purpose of these journeys were often decided entirely by the men leading them. And during the 19th century, those men weren't just explorers, they were celebrities. To people back in Europe, they were something close to mythological figures. They traveled into places that were barely mapped, returned with stories that sounded impossible, and then had those stories printed, sold, and retold until they became legend. Waterfalls no one had seen before, vast rivers cutting through continents, animals that seemed unreal to anyone who had never left their home country. These weren't just scientific missions, they were spectacles. And among all of these figures, one name stood above the rest: Henry Morton Stanley. By the time this expedition was being organized, Stanley had already built a reputation that made him the obvious choice. He had crossed Central Africa, traced major rivers, and most famously tracked down the missing missionary David Livingstone. That moment alone secured his place in history. But the expedition we're talking about now would end up defining his legacy in a very different way. Not because of what it accomplished, but because of what it revealed. So why did this expedition even happen in the first place? To answer that, you have to go back to the political situation at the time. In the early 1880s, Egypt controlled a southern territory known as Equatoria. This region sits in what is now South Sudan, and while it was technically under Egyptian authority, it was far removed from the central power structure. The man placed in charge of it was Emin Pasha, who governed the region on Egypt's behalf. For a time, everything functioned normally. Supplies moved in and out, communication lines remained open, and control was maintained. But that stability didn't last. In Sudan, a man named Muhammad Ahmad began a revolt against Egyptian rule. What started as resistance quickly turned into a full-scale movement. His forces gained momentum, captured key locations, and by 1885 they took the city of Khartoum. That single event had massive consequences. It severed the connection between Egypt and Equatoria entirely. With supply lines cut and communication gone, Emin Pasha and everyone under his command were effectively stranded. Isolated, surrounded by uncertainty, and with no clear support coming. Back in Europe, this created a problem. Not just a logistical one, but a political one. Leaving a governor abandoned in a remote territory wasn't something any power wanted to openly accept. But at the same time, sending a full military expedition deep into Central Africa was expensive, risky, and unpopular. So instead, a different solution was proposed: send a private expedition. Let someone else take the risk, but still achieve the objective. And with his reputation, Stanley was chosen to lead it. Officially, the mission was simple: reach Emin Pasha and bring him back safely. Unofficially, it was far more complicated. Because while multiple European interests supported the expedition, they didn't all want the same outcome. And that becomes clear when you look at the route they chose. If the goal was purely rescue, the logical approach would have been from the east coast, moving inland toward Equatoria. Instead, Stanley and his expedition entered through the Congo, through territory controlled by Leopold II. That decision wasn't accidental. It meant that as they traveled, they weren't just heading toward their destination, they were moving through land that Leopold had a personal interest in developing, exploiting, and expanding. It also meant they could transport goods along the way. Trade wasn't a side effect of the mission, it was built into it. At one point, the expedition was responsible for moving massive quantities of ivory, tens of tons, along the same route. So while the mission was framed as humanitarian, it was also undeniably commercial. And that dual purpose would affect everything that followed. Stanley spent months assembling the expedition. He recruited experienced individuals, former soldiers, specialists, naturalists, and support staff. By the time they departed, the group numbered in the hundreds. Not just Europeans, but also local guides, porters, and workers who would make the journey possible. Before leaving, Stanley made it clear what the mission was supposed to represent. He described it as a rescue effort, not a conquest. A mission to help, not to dominate. But statements like that tend to mean less once reality sets in. Among those selected to join the expedition was a man named James Jameson. His background was very different from most of the others. He came from wealth, significant wealth, as the grandson of the founder of Jameson Irish Whiskey. But unlike others in his position, he didn't focus on business. He was drawn to natural history, exploration, observation. By this point, he had already traveled extensively, documenting wildlife and contributing to scientific understanding. Several species were even named after him. On paper, he was more than qualified to be part of an expedition like this. And at first, nothing about his presence seemed unusual. But like many things in this story, context changes everything. Because while the expedition presented itself as organized and well-prepared, it relied on people and systems that were far from stable. One of those people was Tipu Tip. Before entering the Congo, the expedition stopped in Zanzibar, where they arranged for his involvement. He was a powerful figure with extensive networks across Central Africa. He controlled supply routes, had access to manpower, and understood the region in ways the Europeans did not. On the surface, bringing him along made sense. He could help move goods, establish connections, and support the expedition's progress. But there was a problem. Tipu Tip's influence didn't come from trade alone. It came from slavery. He was one of the most prolific slave traders operating in the region. His wealth, his networks, and his power were all built on that system. And by bringing him into the expedition, they were associating themselves directly with that reality. Local communities knew who he was. They knew what he represented. So when the expedition arrived expecting cooperation, expecting trade, supplies, and assistance, they didn't get it. People refused. Not necessarily because of Stanley or his men, but because of who stood with them. And almost immediately, things started to break down. Supplies became difficult to secure. Communication failed. The plans they had relied on didn't match the situation they found themselves in. And from that point forward, the expedition was no longer operating under controlled conditions. It was reacting, adapting, struggling to maintain direction in an environment where very little went as expected. And that's where the real story begins. Not a system built on exchanging labor or negotiated trade, his entire network was centered around people he controlled directly. And now, that same figure was moving along the Congo River with the expedition, representing their interests whether they intended it or not. So it wasn't surprising that local communities were hesitant, if not outright unwilling, to cooperate. Trust was already fragile, and bringing someone with that reputation only made things worse. On top of that, the logistical issues started almost immediately. Boats that had been promised weren't ready, supplies weren't where they were supposed to be. Communication failures meant that nothing had been properly prepared in advance. So instead of moving forward as one coordinated unit, the expedition had to improvise. Stanley made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He split the group into two separate divisions. One would push forward, continuing toward their objective. The other would remain behind, maintaining supplies and ensuring that resources could still reach the front. It was a standard strategy for long expeditions, but it came with risks. If either side failed, the entire mission could collapse. The forward column, led by Henry Morton Stanley, moved deeper into the interior. The rear column stayed behind, responsible for logistics, stability, and survival over time. And while both groups would face difficulties, it was the rear column where the most disturbing events would eventually unfold. But before that, the forward column had its own problems. Almost immediately after separating, conditions began to deteriorate. Disease spread through the group, taking lives at a steady pace. Encounters with local groups sometimes turned hostile, leading to skirmishes that further reduced their numbers. Supplies ran low faster than expected, and with no reliable support line yet established, every setback made the next one harder to survive. Over time, hunger became a constant factor. The group wasn't just traveling anymore, they were enduring. Months passed like this. Progress slowed. Morale dropped. And by the time they finally reached Lake Albert, the situation had already taken a heavy toll. This was supposed to be the point where they would find Emin Pasha. Instead, they learned that he had moved, attempting to meet them somewhere along the way. For a time, it seemed like they had missed each other entirely, passing in opposite directions without knowing it. Eventually, on April 29, 1888, they finally made contact over a year after the expedition had begun its journey into the Congo. But even that moment didn't unfold the way Stanley had expected. The original plan assumed that Emin Pasha would be in need of rescue, possibly starving or desperate for support. Instead, the opposite was true. The forward column arrived weakened, exhausted, and nearly out of resources. And it was Pasha who had to provide for them. Even small details from that moment highlight how strange the situation had become. Despite everything, months of hardship, loss, and uncertainty, the expedition still had items they had carried the entire way, including bottles of champagne, originally meant to celebrate success. Somehow, those had survived the journey intact. It's a small detail, but it says a lot about priorities. Then came the part no one had anticipated. Emin Pasha didn't want to leave. From his perspective, the situation wasn't beyond recovery. He still had authority, still had people under his command, and believed that if communication could be restored, everything could return to normal. Stanley saw it differently. After everything his group had gone through to get there, staying wasn't an option. The idea of remaining in a region that had already cost them so much didn't make sense. And whether influenced by exhaustion, pressure, or the interests behind the expedition, he pushed for departure. The disagreement wasn't minor. It lasted for months. And during that time, the expedition remained in place, unable to move forward or back. Stanley had lost too many men to simply retrace his steps. He needed more resources, more support, more time. So for nearly another year, they stayed, gathering what they could and preparing for the return journey. Meanwhile, the numbers told their own story. The forward column had started with hundreds of men. By the time they reached Pasha, less than half remained. The rest had died, deserted, or been lost along the way. Eventually, the tension reached a breaking point. In April of 1889, Stanley made it clear he was leaving, with or without Pasha. Faced with that decision, Pasha finally agreed to go. And so the expedition turned back, beginning another long journey out of the region. This time, they passed through areas controlled by other European powers, which made the return somewhat more stable. But even then, the absurdity of the entire situation didn't stop. At one point, while staying in a European-controlled territory, the group attended a formal gathering. During that event, Pasha reportedly drank heavily and nearly died after falling from a window. After everything, the isolation, the conflict, the years spent trying to reach him, that was almost how it ended. Eventually, what remained of the forward and rear columns reunited, and by 1890, the expedition returned to Europe. On the surface, it was treated as a success. Stanley published his account in Darkest Africa and it became widely read. The narrative focused on endurance, exploration, and achievement. The men involved were recognized, praised, and in some cases celebrated. But that version of the story didn't last. Because people started asking questions. Too many people had died. Too many details didn't add up. And most importantly, very little had been said about what happened to the rear column. That group had been left behind under the command of Edmund Barthelot, and according to the initial reports, his story ended simply: he had been killed. Alongside that, James Jameson was said to have died from illness. But those explanations felt incomplete. Too brief, too convenient. Survivors had returned. People who had seen what happened. And when they spoke, their accounts painted a very different picture. Stanley knew what they had said. He had heard it directly. But when he wrote his book, he chose not to include those details. At least, not at first. It wasn't until pressure built, journalists asking questions, inconsistencies being pointed out, that he finally addressed it publicly. In November of 1890, he released a statement describing what he had been told. And instead of clarifying things, it made everything worse. Because what he revealed wasn't a story of failure or mismanagement. It was something far darker. According to multiple accounts, the rear column began to collapse almost as soon as it was left behind. The plan had been simple: wait, establish supply lines, and support the forward group, but that depended on cooperation that never fully materialized. Tip had been expected to help organize the flow of supplies, but that required agreements with other traders in the region, and those agreements depended on resources, specifically ammunition, which the rear column didn't have, so the system failed before it even began, and once it did, there was nothing holding things together anymore. The situation deteriorated faster than anyone had anticipated. The entire logistical plan depended on resources that were no longer available, and once it became clear that the rear column couldn't establish a working supply chain, everything shifted from organized expedition to survival scenario. With no ammunition to trade, no structured agreements in place, and no reliable support from outside, Tip withdrew from the situation entirely. And once he did, the rear column was effectively stranded. They weren't advancing. They weren't retreating. They were waiting. And waiting in that environment, without preparation or stability, quickly became dangerous. Food supplies began to run out within months. Attempts to trade with nearby communities failed, not only because of distrust but because the expedition no longer had anything of value to offer. Desperation set in, and with it came decisions that crossed clear moral lines. Members of the rear column began taking hostages from nearby villages, using them as leverage to force exchanges for food and supplies. What started as a survival tactic only made their situation worse, increasing hostility and leading to further attacks. At the same time, disease spread through the camp. Weakness, exhaustion, and fear became constant conditions. And as things worsened, discipline began to collapse. Some of the men deserted, choosing to take their chances elsewhere rather than remain in a situation that seemed increasingly hopeless. Others stayed, either because they believed rescue might still come or because they had no viable way to leave. Communication with the forward column had completely broken down. No messages, no updates, no confirmation that Stanley's group was even still alive. From the perspective of the rear column, they had been abandoned. And over time, that belief began to shape behavior. Numbers dropped rapidly. Out of the hundreds originally assigned to the rear column, only a fraction remained. And within that environment, isolated, unstable, and increasingly hostile leadership became critical. Unfortunately, the man in charge was not equipped to handle it. Edmund Barthelot began to change. At first, it may have seemed like stress, the result of pressure and deteriorating conditions. But according to multiple accounts, his behavior became erratic, then aggressive, and eventually dangerous. He reportedly began turning the men against each other, spreading suspicion and paranoia. Statements suggesting that Stanley had intentionally led them into danger, that the expedition itself was a setup, that no one was coming back. Whether he believed these things or used them to maintain control, the effect was the same: morale collapsed even further. His actions became increasingly violent. Witnesses described moments where he would lash out without warning, physically assaulting those under his command. There are accounts of him attacking people directly, using whatever was at hand. A staff, a weapon, even his own hands. One particularly disturbing detail describes him biting a woman during an altercation, an act that left even those around him unsettled. Over time, these incidents became more frequent. Punishments grew harsher. Minor infractions were met with severe responses: public beatings, excessive discipline, actions meant to assert authority but which only deepened resentment. The structure of command shifted from leadership to control through fear, and that kind of control doesn't last long, especially in an already unstable environment. Reports suggest that even those closest to him recognized that something was wrong. Some tried to intervene, others tried to distance themselves. But without a clear alternative authority, the situation continued to degrade. At one point, deserters from the forward column reached the rear group and brought news, false or not, that Stanley had died. According to accounts, Bartolot's reaction wasn't concern or disbelief. It was relief. A statement suggesting that with Stanley gone, he would rise in rank. Whether that was said seriously or in a moment of instability, it reveals something about his mindset at the time. His writings, where they exist, reflect a growing sense of paranoia, suspicion toward those around him, belief that others were plotting against him, frustration with the situation he could no longer control. And as that mental state worsened, so did his decisions. Eventually, the situation reached a breaking point. According to reports later shared by Henry Morton Stanley, the final incident began with something minor, noise. Early in the morning, there was singing and drumming near the camp. Attempts were made to stop it, first through intermediaries, then through warnings. When those failed, Bartolot took it upon himself to confront the situation directly. Armed and already agitated, he approached the source, a woman performing traditional morning music. He ordered her to stop. When she didn't, he escalated. Physical force, aggression, repeated attempts to assert control through violence. And in that moment, the situation shifted from confrontation to retaliation. The woman's husband, witnessing what was happening, responded. From a nearby position, he fired a shot. Bartolot was killed instantly. It was a sudden end, but not an unexpected one given everything that had led up to it. And in a tragic extension of that event, the man responsible for the shot was later executed. Not as part of any structured justice, but as another act within a system that had already broken down. When Stanley later addressed these events, he made a point of explaining why they had been omitted from his original account. He argued that others present could have intervened, that the situation might have been prevented if someone had taken action sooner. But statements like that don't change what happened. At most, they shift responsibility. What remains clear is that the rear column became something very different from what it was intended to be. It wasn't just a failed logistical unit. It was a group that lost structure, lost control, and ultimately lost any sense of the original mission. And while the collapse of leadership explains part of that, it doesn't explain everything. Because despite everything that happened, the violence, the deaths, the breakdown of order, that's not what defined the expedition in public memory. The event that people remember, the one that continues to be debated, centers around someone else entirely. James Jameson. Back in Europe, he was known for very different reasons: wealth, education, scientific contribution. He was seen as a figure of curiosity and intellect, someone who traveled not for power, but for knowledge. Which is why the accusation that surfaced later was so difficult for people to accept. According to reports published after the expedition, Jameson had been involved in an incident that went far beyond anything else described. The claim wasn't just that he witnessed something disturbing, it was that he arranged it, that he knowingly took part in an act where a young girl was killed, not out of necessity or conflict, but out of curiosity, specifically, to observe and document what followed. When this was first reported, even those presenting the information seemed hesitant. The idea itself was almost too extreme to accept without question. The primary evidence came from testimonies, statements passed through multiple individuals, translated, repeated, and eventually recorded. And because of that, there was room for doubt. Critics argued that the accounts relied too heavily on secondhand information. That phrases like "I was told" appeared too often to be considered definitive proof. At the same time, supporters of the claim pointed out that multiple sources described similar events, that details aligned too closely to be entirely fabricated, and that even partial confirmation was enough to raise serious concerns. What made the situation even more complicated was that both key figures, Bartolot and Jameson, were already dead by the time these accusations became public. They couldn't respond, couldn't clarify, couldn't defend themselves, which meant that everything depended on the accounts left behind by others. And those accounts didn't agree on everything, but they agreed on enough to make the story impossible to ignore. So where does this report come in the first place? Well, there were a few people who bore witness to this cannibalistic act, but the most complete account, and the first one we get in detail, is that of Jameson's interpreter. Assad Fawn followed Jameson around and acted as his interpreter to the locals. Fawn was the one who began talking about this story after it first happened and reported it to the rest of the rear column, which eventually made its way up to some of the front column. These were the reports that Stanley had heard about while in Africa and decided to omit from his book. Well, after Stanley came out with his report on November 8 in the Times, Varon would come out with his own statement only 6 days later in the New York Times, or at least the New York Times would publish his affidavit. So we need some background as to when this exact moment took place. According to the story, at several points Jameson tried to regain contact with Tip. Jameson would go to him and try to get more couriers so that they could get the supply lines going. Every time, Tipu would ask for exorbitant amounts of money that Jameson didn't have because, keep in mind, Tip had already left the expedition on their own, but he was still doing business around the area. So if Jameson knew where Tip was, he would try to go find him. Well, it was supposedly while Tip was doing business with the Reba tribe, a group that was around what is now the Lokandu community. While at this tribe, Jameson was with Tipu, witnessing a festival. And at this festival, according to Furin, this happened. Jameson expressed to Tipu's interpreter a curiosity to witness cannibalism. Tipu consulted with the chiefs and told Jameson he had better purchase a slave. Jameson asked the price and paid 6 handkerchiefs. A man returned a few minutes afterward with a 10-year-old girl. Tipu and the chiefs ordered the girl to be taken to the native huts. Jameson himself, Salem, Masandi, and Farani, Jameson's servant, presented to him by Tipu, and many others followed. The man who had brought the girl said to the cannibals, "This is a present from a white man who desires to see her eaten." The girl was tied to a tree, says Furin, the natives sharpening their knives the while. One of them then stabbed her twice in the belly. She did not scream, but seemed to know what would happen, looking to the right and left for help. When stabbed, she fell dead. The natives cut pieces from her body. Jameson, in the meantime, made rough sketches of the horrible scenes. Then they all returned to the chief's house. Jameson afterward went to his tent, where he finished his sketches in watercolors. There were 6 of them, all neatly done. The first sketch was of the girl as she was led to the tree. The second showed her stabbed, the blood gushing from the wounds. The third showed her dissected. The fourth, fifth, and sixth showed men carrying off various parts of the body. Jameson showed these and many other sketches to the chiefs. This, of course, is a level of evil and depravity that is hard to comprehend. We hear about things like serial killers or family murderers, but even with monsters like that, there's something strangely reassuring in the idea that they have to hide it. Even if they don't feel guilt, they know they cannot let others see what they've done. But something this extreme, done openly, where a person not only witnesses it but enables it, and then documents it, that is a different level entirely. It's difficult to even put into words. And this seems to be the story that Stanley heard and chose to omit from his original book, but later brought to light publicly. So what is this then? Just 2 men from an expedition who went mad and acted on their worst impulses? Most likely, yes. But when it comes to Jameson's account, there is some speculation. This was published on November 14th. In the midst of all this coming out about Jameson, his widowed wife was doing everything she could to save his reputation. She publicly criticized Stanley's account, and as soon as this report appeared in the New York Times, the next day her own statement was published. As mentioned, Jameson became ill and died in the Congo. According to her, 2 nights before he died, he sent a telegram. The wider public didn't yet know about the cannibalism story, but within the expedition, people were already talking about it. So, according to her, this message was sent to Sir William McKinnon, one of the men involved in the expedition. In an attempt to clear his name, Jameson allegedly said, "Upon arrival at Riba, the chief invited me to his residence, where I witnessed a curious native dance following other ceremonies, which Tipu said was usually followed by a cannibal feast. I laughed skeptically, whereupon another Arab described a horrible story. I flatly declared that it was impossible that this could happen. The Arab replied, 'Give me a bit of cloth and see.' I thought this a mere ruse to obtain a gift, but the Arab had formerly been kind, so I gave him 6 handkerchiefs. Then followed the most horrible scene I ever witnessed in my life. The whole thing happened so quickly that it was impossible to make sketches even if I had wanted to. Further, I had nothing to sketch with. The small sketches I later made were done in the evening at my own house. The girl never looked for help. She seemed to know it was her fate. She never stirred hand, foot, or head. How the girl was obtained, I do not yet know, but I will send all particulars signed by witnesses as promised. Events like this are often scrutinized. That's because a lot of people point out that Asad Furin is an untrustworthy storyteller. Years later, he would say that he recanted this statement and that he made it up because he was angry that Jameson fired him. As a matter of fact, Jameson's wife, in her November 15th statement, also tries to discredit Asad. After presenting Jameson's version, she includes a note claiming that Asad had previously boasted about swindling the British government during the purchase of camels at Saqqam. It also states that he made money by sharing in the spoils taken from gamblers among the troops. The statement concludes by calling him a low brute whose word Belgian officers would accept to destroy my character. But here's the thing, even if that's true, and even if Asad had a questionable past, his story cannot be entirely fabricated. It aligns too closely with what appears in Jameson's own account, the one his wife presented to the papers. Later, Asad would claim that he made the entire story up. But that doesn't fully hold up, because both accounts mention the same key elements, the purchase of cloth and the act of cannibalism that followed. That overlap is hard to ignore. What most likely happened is this: Assad may have been angry and may have wanted to expose what he saw Jameson do. But later, when the controversy grew and public pressure mounted to preserve Jameson's reputation, he may have been pressured or intimidated into recanting his statement. We know he didn't invent everything. The similarities are too strong, so it's possible someone coerced him into saying he lied. However, Assad wasn't the only one connected to this story. There were other witnesses, or at least people who saw evidence of what happened. Remember William Bonney, one of the surviving Europeans who later reported details to Stanley? He wasn't present during the actual event, but he claimed to have seen the sketches that Assad described. According to Bonney, Mr. Jameson showed me the sketches and described the scene in detail. I cannot now describe each of the 6 sketches, but they begin with the picture of the girl being brought down, tied by one hand to a native who holds in his right hand the fatal knife. He is then shown thrusting the knife into the girl, with blood spurting from the wound. Then there is the scene of the carving up of the girl limb by limb, and of the native scrambling for the pieces and running away to cook them. The final sketch represents the feast. Some people try to point out inconsistencies between Bonney's account and Furin's, for example, whether the final sketch depicted dismemberment or the feast itself. Some even suggest that Jameson may have stayed to watch the feast. But it's also entirely possible that this is simply 2 different people recalling the same set of drawings from memory. Minor differences like that don't necessarily discredit the core story. It's worth noting that while you can find versions of these 6 sketches online, the originals no longer exist. What you see today are reconstructions based on these descriptions. Stanley later added that Bonney told him Jameson even expressed pride in being the only European to witness such an event, which, again, speaks to a level of moral detachment that is difficult to comprehend. Still, as these reports came out, many people refused to believe them. Stanley's expedition had gone terribly wrong, and critics argued it would be convenient for him to shift blame onto men who were already dead and unable to defend themselves. It's much easier to claim that others went mad and committed atrocities than to admit failure in leadership. There was a lot of finger-pointing, conflicting accounts, and accusations on all sides. But ultimately, there is one source we can look at that is harder to dismiss: Jameson himself. Not a public statement meant to protect his image, but his private diary. Jameson died of fever on August 17, 1888. He had been attempting to reach a telegraph station and managed to get there, but died the following day. As a naturalist, he kept detailed records of his experiences, documenting wildlife and events throughout his journey. After his death, his diary was published in 1890 under the title The Story of the Rear Column of the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition, and in it, he wrote about that day. He describes witnessing a tribal dance, after which Tippa-Tip told him that the people often killed individuals and held feasts, noting that the Wakusu were terrible cannibals. He recounts stories told to him about past battles where bodies disappeared overnight because they had been eaten. He describes hearing that 2 men could consume 1 person in a single night. Then he writes about an incident involving a well, how the water appeared oily, and how it was later discovered that human meat had been washed there, leaving a layer of fat floating on the surface. He admits that he had previously dismissed such stories as exaggerations or lies told by travelers. But then, he writes this: "I sent my boy for 6 handkerchiefs, thinking it was all a joke and that they were not in earnest. But presently, a man appeared leading a young girl of about 10 years old by the hand, and I then witnessed the most horribly sickening sight I am ever likely to see in my life. He plunged a knife quickly into her breast, twice. She fell on her face, turning onto her side. 3 men then ran forward and began to cut up the body of the girl. Finally, her head was cut off, and not a particle remained, each man taking his piece down to the river to wash it. The most extraordinary thing was that the girl never uttered a sound nor struggled until she fell. Until the last moment, I could not believe they were in earnest. I have heard many stories of this kind since I have been in this country, but never could believe them, and I never would have been such a beast as to witness this. That's because a lot of people point out that Assad Furin is an untrustworthy storyteller. As years later he would say that he recanted this statement and that he made it up because he was mad that Jameson fired him. As a matter of fact, Jameson's wife in this November 15th paper goes to discredit Assad as well, because after Jameson's statement, it says then follows the statement that Assad boasted of swindling the British government in the purchase of camels at Saqqam, where he also made money by dividing with policemen spoils captured from gamblers among the troops. The statement concludes as follows: "This is the low brute whose word the Belgium officers would accept to destroy my character." But here's the thing. Even if that's true and that's signed by people that Assad had stolen camels or whatever, his story can't be entirely made up because it corroborates too closely with what his wife's letter said, or his letter that his wife brought to the paper. Because later Assad would say, "Oh, I made the whole thing up." But we know he didn't, because both of them mention a purchase of cloth and the act of cannibalism happening. I think what most likely happened is Fawn may have been mad and he may have wanted to spread the story of what he saw Jameson do. But years later, when this was controversial and everyone was mad that Jameson's reputation was being ruined, Fawn was bullied into recanting his statement. We know he didn't make everything up. it's too close to Jameson's account, so maybe someone coerced him into saying he did. However, there are some other people who bear witness to things relating to this cannibal act as well. Remember how I said William Bonney was one of the surviving Europeans who reported a lot of this to Stanley? Well, Bonney wasn't there when it took place, but according to him, he did see the sketches that Varen had mentioned. According to Bonney, quote, Mr. Jameson showed me the sketches and described the scene in detail. I cannot now describe each of the 6 sketches, but they begin with the picture of the girl being brought down, tied by one hand to the native, who holds in his right hand the fatal knife. He is then represented thrusting the knife into the girl while the blood is seen spurting out. Then there is the scene of the carving up of the girl limb by limb and of the native scrambling for the pieces and running away to cook them. The final sketch represents the feast. Now a lot of people will nitpick the details between Bonney's account and Varen's account. Like Varen says the final sketch was the dismemberment, but here Bonney saying it was the feast. Some pointed that to say perhaps Jameson stuck around for the feast afterwards. But I also think it's possible these are 2 different people describing 6 pictures they saw once. So maybe there's just some variation there. You'll see these 6 sketches depicted online, but we don't have the original 6 sketches. They're just recreations based on these accounts. Stanley goes on to say that Bonney elaborated more to him back in Africa, saying that Jameson went as far as to say he takes pride in being the only European to have witnessed this happen, which again supports the idea of deliberate curiosity rather than innocence. But as these reports were coming out, a lot of people just didn't believe them. I mean, Stanley had an expedition go horribly wrong. It would be tempting to throw the blame on someone else. So, a lot of people thought maybe he's just shifting responsibility onto 2 people who can't defend themselves. Thankfully, we can cut through a lot of the noise and just look at what Jameson himself wrote in his diary. Not a public defense, not something meant to save face, but his own private record. His account confirms key elements of the event, the exchange of cloth, the presence of the girl, and the act itself. Even though he frames it as disbelief and shock, his own words still place him directly at the center of what happened. And that's what makes this story so disturbing. Even in the most charitable interpretation, he still enabled it. Whether through curiosity, arrogance, or detachment, he crossed a line that cannot be undone. The entire story paints a grim picture not just of one man, but of the mindset surrounding these expeditions. A belief in superiority mixed with detachment from human life. The same mindset that allowed atrocities to happen across the Congo during that era. In the end, it's easy to argue about details, about who said what, and whether parts were exaggerated. But the core of the story remains consistent across multiple sources. A girl died, and it happened because someone wanted to see what would happen. And that's why the Jameson affair is remembered not just as a historical controversy, but as one of the darkest examples of human curiosity taken to its absolute worst extreme.